Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, wherever you happen to be. 37 participants, that's pretty healthy for day 4 of an event like this that bends your brain. So thanks for coming. I am Leah McFadden at UBC, co-host of Lassie with the group here. Also, my colleagues Craig Thompson and Alison Myers co-hosting. I'm very pleased today to be introducing our second keynote speaker of the week, who is my very good UBC colleague here in Vancouver in Canada, Dr. Warren Code. Dr. Code is the Associate Director of the Science Center for Learning and Teaching here at UBC in our Faculty of Science. It's often referred to as Skylight. And if you'd like to find out what they're up to, check out skylight.ubc.ca. In Skylight, Warren leads and advises on and assists with planning and managing and studying and evaluating all kinds of teaching and learning projects in relation to science and mathematics. He previously spent several years as acting director for a major science education initiative that took place at UBC, the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative, which was very large and involved a significant network of department-based fellows who worked with faculty members to bring research-informed instruction to their undergraduate courses in mathematics and science. Warren also acted at one point as one of these teaching and learning fellows in the UBC mathematics department, studying teaching methods and student success. And that's also where he first started to get involved in learning analytics related to online homework and introductory scientific programming. Most recently, he's been working with other partners at UBC to develop plans and processes to support emerging work in learning analytics in science and math departments. The title of Dr. Code's talk today is Applying Research on Expertise Development and Considering the Role of Learning Analytics. Introducing this talk, he writes, institutional scale change towards effective research-informed practices takes coordination and attention to the strategies used to drive that change. I will introduce one successful model that harnessed key results from research on the development of expertise to spread effective teaching practices across mathematics and science departments at our university, and which has since been adopted by other institutions in their teaching reform efforts. Along with making the connection with research on expertise to its application, both in teaching undergraduates and in the development of faculty and staff around teaching, I'll share some recommendations for those interested in making change at scale in their home institution. I'll also discuss how learning analytics offers important contributions to these broader efforts, both by expanding the base of educational research in novel ways and in its potential to support evidence-based decisions in teaching at various levels. So I will hand over to Warren, who will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have some time at the end of the hour for questions. I look forward to an interesting applied presentation about making use of learning analytics to scale projects. Warren, you're on.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for to the organizers for inviting me. As we get started today, make sure my slides will move. So as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the work I'll be talking about today, and where I'm joining you from today is on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Many places with a long colonial history are still grappling with that history, including Canada and here on our campus. What it means to live and work in this place, what it means for the university to be here, and the history of this place and the Musqueam people who were here for a long time before the university and who are still here. This link at the bottom, nativeland.ca, is to a resource that maps out Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages all over the world. I know it has a .ca domain name, but it's actually expanded well beyond Canada, this project. I know many of you are joining from many places today, and I encourage you to consider that as an opportunity to learn more about those places, if that applies to you as well. And to say a little bit more about kind of why I'm joining you, as mentioned, I'll be talking about a large initiative here at the University of British Columbia's Vancouver campus, where I'm based in the Faculty of Science. To give you a sense of scale, our Faculty of Science has about 10,000 students in various programs and teaches about that many again in other programs like arts, business, and engineering. So we're a pretty big institution overall. And I'll be providing this as an example of kind of large scale change at an institution and to suggest ideas for spreading interest and use of learning analytics on your campuses. And kind of my connection here, we're here at LASI as part of the learning analytics community. And I have a connection to the learning analytics community, but also to other one way you could characterize them is multidisciplinary communities related to education. So the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, discipline-based education research, educational development, which is kind of more where my job title lives. So these are folks that work in institutions, generally in higher education, on teaching improvement projects, partnering with the people teaching, helping to measure student learning, also called academic development in many other parts of the world. So these are all multidisciplinary communities connected with teaching and learning. But being multidisciplinary, they've often struggled with existential questions like, so for learning, what is learning analytics? How is it similar or different to X or Y? And often these communities don't have like a natural home at a university. This has shifted over time, but they share kind of these commonalities that they're about teaching and learning. They have a research base, but like a very applied sort of bent to them. And there's generally interest among these communities to figure out, how to get more people interested, how to get your tools and approaches into classrooms, to have instructors and students using them. You can see this in the offerings at LASI. I first attended in 2019, and I went to a tutorial, Learning Analytics Deployment Tactics, a meta tutorial. So it was about spreading practices of learning analytics. After this talk, I'm going to the tutorial, Scaling Learning Analytics, a People-Centered Approach by Dr. Tsai. And then maybe most noticeably this week was the first keynote by Dr. Culver. He introduced us to this framework for change in institutions of higher education, specifically around learning analytics. And that was exciting for me because that's the kind of thing I talk to people about all the time. And so I hope what you take away from today is kind of complementary to what we heard in the first keynote. So I'll be talking about a large initiative transforming teaching here at UBC, and I'll be noting along the way some of the overlap with learning analytics, both in terms of like learning analytics practices, but also as a community pushing to improve higher education. And so to do that, I have these sort of 3 chapters prepared. So talking about the development of expertise and kind of defining what I mean by that. What does it mean to be an expert? Because we kind of centered our initiative kind of around that concept. Talking about institutional change, what did our initiative look like? How did we make things happen here? And then trying to move it towards your consideration for you. What might you and your colleagues do in your context? So let's move to the first of those, which is talking about development of expertise. And this draws on what is now going back a few decades worth of research. And there's this real kind of convergence going back to kind of the mid 2000s was when this initiative was kind of first being thought up. But a convergence between, neurology, brain research, cognitive psychology. So those would be lab experiments, but on, what makes for people learning, but also kind of in place college classroom studies. And the convergence here was that what makes for effective learning is you can kind of frame the educational goal as thinking more like a scientist, for example, thinking more like a biologist, developing greater biology expertise. And that has sort of a few components. So when we talk about being an expert, they found some commonalities, and this is research across various cognitive domains. So people accomplishing complex tasks in the course of their work, historians, scientists, chess players are a favorite for this research, doctors, for example. So they not found some common elements. One is they have a large base of factual knowledge. So this isn't surprising, but I think in a lot of maybe popular imagination of like, what is an expert on such and such topic, people might stop at this as kind of like, oh, that's what makes the expert. But beyond that base of knowledge, experts also have a way of organizing that knowledge. So they have an organizational framework rather than, well, there's a whole bunch of kind of pieces of knowledge. If you like the papers on the desk on the left, they have some kind of efficient filing system for retrieval and application. They will recognize patterns. They will recognize relationships. They will understand concepts related to all these kind of pieces of knowledge. So it's much more than just knowing facts. It's also being able to kind of relate and apply those facts. And then the other kind of thing that brings it together is experts demonstrate, and you may have heard of this as metacognition, but the ability to monitor their own thinking and learning. So as a result of these kind of combining all these together, what does an expert look like in their domain? Well, there's somebody who can solve problems relatively easily, and they can complete a lot of tasks really fluidly or automatically because of that sort of very high level of competence, and likely confidence as well. And they're also able to transfer, so they can also draw on kind of principles and structure that they know about to apply it in novel situations as well. So, so this is kind of what an expert looks like. So if you want to become an expert, what does the research suggest there? So it's kind of, you want to move towards that kind of collection of things. So if we think about what does it mean to learn to become an expert, so you'd be acquiring a set of component skills and knowledge. So there's kind of building that base, but also practice combining and integrating those components, right? And you're building that fluency in using those kind of flexibly in problem solving, and also understanding context really well, understanding conditions in which you'd apply what was learned. And the kind of companion finding of this, as far as like, how does this kind of come about, is this notion of deliberate practice. So this is kind of really central to what the initiative we're talking about, so in terms of like, when we think about teaching methods, it's really enabling or kind of enacting this idea of deliberate practice. And the kind of an overarching finding is that everyone requires many hours of deliberate practice. And this is different from just practice. So it has to be challenging, but not too hard. It includes reflecting on progress and getting feedback, isolating and then integrating components. So this is the difference between, for example, playing a bunch of games of chess. You would get better over time if you played like 1,000 games of chess. But if you spent the same amount of time and you included, studying specific situations, potential of different pieces, and practicing those things when you actually do play some games, you'll get way more payoff. So you'll just get way better at chess than someone who played the 1,000 games. So this research on expertise has become very popular in kind of in terms of this 10,000 hours concept. And that's kind of where the origin of that estimate and that sort of thing. That tends to be a simplification depending on what you've read, but it is in that kind of same neighborhood. And then the other compatible finding out of the kind of neurology studies, as it says here, brain changes result. So there are detectable brain changes after periods of intense learning. And so as you're literally a different person than when you started, when you become an expert on something. And so this is an important, when we move to thinking about teaching, this is actually important because experts are just different from novices. And not just that, but like you, the expert, is different from you, the novice, previously. So if we want to think about fostering this as what makes for effective learning, and we want to move our students, so in our case, to become better mathematicians or scientists and grow expertise in that field, we sometimes phrase this in terms of the expertise-centered classroom. So not expert-centered, it's not about the expert, but it's about building expertise. So these classrooms will see, I would say, less traditional elements. So students won't be learning, but they will spend class time while they're doing deliberate practice and doing things like explaining, making judgments, reflecting on the quality of their choices or of someone's work. These are things that experts do. When you go to move to teaching, a challenge is that the experts are usually the people doing the teaching, but experts aren't novices anymore, and it can actually be really hard to remember, like, how does a novice encounter things? Because as an expert, you can't help but notice, patterns and structure, whereas for novices, it might be just a bunch of disconnected ideas. So because novices experience the world differently, that has to be taken in consideration when you're building kind of learning experiences for them. However, we get a kind of meta bonus in this being a central feature of our teaching and learning practices, in that as people who want to see classroom practices that foster deliberate practice among students, while teaching is also a complex activity, like being a scientist. And so it's a thing where people can develop expertise. So we can actually apply these same principles in training or coaching instructors to learn about what makes for effective teaching and to take on new ways of teaching. And this is one connection for learning analytics. So learning analytics can kind of fit in here, I would say, by facilitating feedback to and from instructors. It makes evaluation, or just generally people having access to information that they otherwise wouldn't, or that, it's either new information or just something that in practice wouldn't be possible to see. So it can help instructors or their students reflect and make judgments. So that's a really important part of this, and can be a really novel contribution. So that's kind of the basis and kind of the research base that we were kind of drawing on in sort of a general sense when we so I wasn't there at the very beginning, but when UBC embarked on the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative, which was mentioned in the introduction. And so here the university brought in Carl Wyman, who won a Nobel Prize in physics, but then spent much of his career in science education reform. And so they brought him in to lead this large initiative starting in 2007, taking sort of similar elements to one he'd started at the University of Colorado Boulder a year before. And a kind of general setup, we have our triangle here, but the general idea is to apply research about how people learn in undergraduate classrooms. So bringing all this thing about expertise and what makes for effective learning and getting it into our actual classrooms, measuring effects of what happens. So publishing out research, but just generally, evaluating and seeing how things are going with those changes, and sharing out as well. So there's a real commitment to that. The scale, so some more details about the initiative. So this started in 2007. The kind of high level overview of the setup, UBC, and there were donations solicited kind of back against this amount, but the total was about $11 million US dollars spent across the 7 departments over this sort of 10-year period, so 2007 through 2017. The basic structure here was there were sort of competitive internal grants for departments. So there was money, but the departments had to apply to receive it. And each one had about 5 to 7 kind of core years of activity based on that. The bulk of the money and what kind of really made this a novel approach to this type of change was the introduction of discipline-based education specialists, or we also called them science teaching and learning fellows here. But this specialist term is one we've been using as a more generic term about these folks, and I'll tell you a bit more about them in a moment. But they were hired to be embedded in departments to work with faculty on these teaching changes. And then there was a central unit to train those specialists and to connect people across departments and manage money and these sorts of things. So that was kind of the setup of the initiative. And I'll give a bit more detail on that. And then if people are interested, I'm happy to talk more about that too. But the results are captured very briefly here on the bottom. So over that 10 years, we saw involvement of about 200 faculty with a real variety in terms of departments. So those 7 departments. So there were as low as 10% of faculty being involved and as high as over 90% in some departments. Reaching and transforming the teaching in over 180 courses. And the goal was this introduction of different terms for this, evidence-based or perhaps research-informed teaching practices. And included in those courses were almost all of the large introductory science courses. So that, because they're disproportionately large, it covers about 2/3 of our course registrations of what's taught here. So this is kind of a uniquely large impact at one institution. This initiative had almost kind of a specialty, these large introductory courses, where when we talk about these teaching practices that were introduced, a lot of it is what people often call sort of active learning. Students are doing things in the classroom, answering questions, talking to one another about their decisions, working on worksheets. Maybe they have some in-class voting, using clickers, these sorts of things, basically enabling things that people, maybe recognize for a long time, like, oh, I of course I do this in like a small class, but I could never do this in a large class. So one specialty of this initiative, I would say, is a really large scale implementation of kind of making even large classes really effective sites for learning. So I'm happy to talk more about different outcomes at length if you're interested, but I'm going to kind of leave that there for now. But this is so the upshot here is that it was very successful. But what I want to dig into more now is kind of how did we get there? So it's more of the details there. So in terms of, say, our model for change, these are sort of some of the assumptions or pieces that went into it. Kind of one important principle is that if you think about the culture of teaching at a university, as much as the university is one institution, where the teaching happens and where people talk about teaching is really centered in departments. People in departments have, strong ties within their discipline, and that actually spans institutions. So somebody in, say, a biology department probably feels like they have a lot more in common with someone in a biology department, across the country than they do with someone in a different department at their same institution. So there's this really like kind of cultural unit, the department, but the kind of flip side of that, when you're thinking about making change, is that makes the department kind of the scale or the target for change. And that was really the reason to bring in this idea of discipline-based education specialists. So this was maybe the most unusual feature of this initiative, but these specialists were postdocs typically, or contract faculty. A few were people on their sabbatical. And they were hired as full-time kind of local experts on teaching in their specific department. So my background was a PhD in mathematics, and I was hired into the math department. These specialists would train up on concepts like deliberate practice and how to work with faculty effectively, how to measure learning, education research in general, because that's not going to be part of their background typically. And so they were kind of brought into this, but so they weren't necessarily the foremost experts on these topics, but they would know more than people in their departments. And they would be this sort of local resource specialist person. Their core activity was partnering with faculty in their department on what we called course transformation projects. So course transformations are where usually over sort of multiple offerings of a course, the instructor and the specialist, they'd be meeting frequently. The specialist would be bringing ideas from the research literature, assisting and giving feedback on design and implementation, kind of adapting that for the specific course, and helping or maybe leading the measurement of student learning in the course and student experience of whatever these new approaches were. And so what ends up being implemented was a combination of instructor interests, motivated perhaps by what they learned from some of these measurements of student learning and experience. And so from a professional development standpoint, I guess this is one place we might connect with the previous keynote. You may or may not remember there was a sort of a list of what makes for effective professional development, and this sort of covers the bases in that it's work focused and active learning, in that it's taking place in live courses. It's certainly meant to be aligned with the goals of the instructors. It's over a substantial period, so often like a couple of years, because the course would be offered maybe once a year. And the important thing is it was kind of this collaboration. So it wasn't the instructor being told what to do. It was really based on kind of their interests, those latent aims that we heard about in the previous talk. So that's that was kind of the core activity of what was going on. There was also, measurement, publishing, and kind of community events. But in terms of how people were spending their time, that was probably the main part. And then, as I mentioned, we had a coordinating unit for professional development, sharing resources, connecting to other institutions, bringing in external researchers or experts, again, to kind of help training and also boost the signal or lend legitimacy to efforts kind of back here at our institution. And another kind of important principle and why UBC committed the amount of money that it did was the idea was this: if we really want to see like an ongoing sustained change, you have to apply. You could think of this as sort of pressure on departments. That's not, it was meant to be something that departments kind of wanted to do, but you have to apply enough of this over a sufficiently long time. Otherwise, it doesn't stick. And so this dollar figure comes from the research on organizational change. So at the time, this was mainly coming from like the business literature, and they had these estimates that you want to spend about 5% of your operational budget on an initiative to make lasting change. So that's actually kind of where they came up with this. So there's an acknowledgement that like if you want it to be big change, it's not necessarily going to be easy, and it's not going to be free. The good news is you don't have to have $11 million to get started. We've advised other institutions and people kind of in individual departments and things. So there's other ways to adapt ideas from this model at smaller scales, and they've seen good results as well. So that's probably the most I'll talk about the specifics of this initiative, but I'm also happy to answer more questions. If you want to learn lots more, so the website has a lot of resources on, so the cwsci.ubc.ca, resources on teaching, so the kinds of teaching and examples of things that people did in the courses here across science and math disciplines. Carl Wyman wrote a book about kind of the history and kind of summaries of what went on both at UBC and at the cousin initiative at, the University of Colorado Boulder. And I wrote with a colleague from that Colorado initiative, the Science Education Initiative Handbook, which includes summaries of some of the other adaptations at other places, as well as recommendations for like getting started making change in a department, with particular recommendations on this department specialist model, but it's not just about that. And this is free, free to read online. So I'm going to mention those as sort of further reading if you want to know a lot more, and you're also welcome to get in touch with me. But I wanted to bring this around to, so what does this kind of mean for you in your context? I wrote how to navigate all this in your context. Depending on your screen size, you might be able to see there is a boat in this picture. So I couldn't really resist the wording there. So I wanted to turn attention to like, what does all of this mean for you? So you probably don't have $11 million. As I said, you don't need that to get started. And I'm hoping that you'll find, some of the principles here valuable in your own setting, wherever that is. I also know, many of you are not based or employed in an institution of higher education. But if you're aiming at transforming higher education, I'm hoping you'll find these are still relevant, since that's kind of where the teaching is happening. So as maybe a first step towards this, I was going to trying to think about, well, okay, so you have a great evidence-based innovation for teaching. You have a great learning analytics project where you want to kind of spread the results or get people to use it in their teaching. Then you do have to worry about this question. So how do you convince people to change their teaching? So quite a bit of work has been done on this. And I guess the answer is there's a lot of different ways, and you probably need to use a bunch of them, maybe not personally, but probably a bunch of them will have to be in play. So for example, building that evidence base. So publishing a great study about a particular teaching approach, and talking to people at an education research conference. So those are important sort of dissemination pieces. That's not really what gets it in the hands of people in the classrooms, but it's also important. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing research, but that's only one piece of this. We're talking about bringing it to practice. People reading about it in journals sort of isn't quite enough. I guess there's findings that it's really just not enough. So telling people about it, maybe at a talk about teaching, so maybe at a department teaching talk, or the education track at a disciplinary conference. Now you're starting to get much closer to kind of people's teaching practices. There's some findings that people make their decisions not necessarily based on that research. So you may have a great effective study, but there were some interesting findings from physics education research, that people would make a decision to use some innovative teaching technique and incorporate it into their practice, mainly based on, did a colleague recommend it, right? And senior colleagues having kind of disproportionate influence. Maybe that's not surprising, but that was kind of their main kind of influence. Or they would be at some new, I think the other main venue was kind of a event for new faculty, learning about things about what it means to be new faculty. So they're kind of like exploring and still trying to form their identity and their kind of practice as an instructor. And so they're maybe a little more open to ideas there. But this idea about recommendation from a colleague was really critical. How do you convince people to keep using something? Again, evidence is sort of like ended up not being the major determining factor. It was really more like, did they have a good experience with it? However that might be defined. So they got some good student feedback that they appreciated, or just generally they feel like it solved a particular challenge that they had identified in their teaching. But it wasn't that necessarily, oh, you ran a really effective, study and measured really carefully student learning. The main role of evidence for those folks was more, oh, well, once I've done something successful, I do want that evidence to like turn around and try to convince other people, sort of ironically. But but the research is still there because you have to have, you want to be doing the right things to make sort of meaningful, lasting change, and if you want to see some actual impact. But then you also have to think about more broadly, like how do I spread things on campus? So one way to also do this is connect with a campus teaching center. So they may have a feel for like, oh, how many people that are teaching, are facing a challenge that this new approach or tool is able to solve. Having or connecting with champions among the faculty. So advocates that are sort of fellow instructors in maybe a nearby discipline. So for us, that's like someone else in the Faculty of Science. That can be convincing for someone, but if it's within their own department, that can generally be more convincing for people. So if you're a person trying to enact change, you want to try to find who are those people and how can we enable them to kind of get the message out. It's also about finding out, what do instructors care about and helping them bring in kind of a relevant approach, even if it's not your favorite one, but it has to be kind of in the toolbox of people that are working directly with faculty on their teaching. And even the kind of, even taking a step back and trying to just get instructors interested in data on their students, information that they otherwise didn't collect that's different from, say, the test results they see and the written kind of standard student evaluations that they see. So getting other kinds of data, that's really going to drive them towards solutions once they kind of discover maybe problems they didn't know they had or problems that existed in a way that they didn't really understand before. And finally, students also have a role in this. So students may also ask for something to start happening. So this was, I think there's sort of a tipping point perhaps for certain kinds of practices, but that was certainly the experience here. After a certain number of years, students in their introductory courses, their experience was with active learning, doing stuff in the classroom, not only listening to lectures. And so then they start to ask, oh, well, why didn't this happen in this course? And that does start to, it's in one way it's pressure, but it could also be motivation for people to at least look into these things. So there's all these different kind of, how do you convince people to change their teaching? There's a lot of different answers to this. And in some sense, it's not that there's one way, it's that there are many ways. And there's a lot of different people that would be involved in kind of making those things happen. So this is kind of maybe one of the broader messages is like, it's about having like a network where people have different roles and no one person is doing everything, but collectively you're accomplishing a lot. So that's one important, I think, lesson for change. A second one, which is kind of my pitch from our specific kind of background of this, thinking about fostering expertise, you can think of uptake of things as, in some ways, it's an education challenge. So this is related to a couple of the pieces from the previous keynote. This idea of socialization was kind of in the mix here. So you're thinking of people being aware and competent. That's now we're talking about gaining expertise in a particular learning analytics approach or program. So thinking about what sort of expertise is needed by, I guess, whoever the users are. Could be an instructor, could be a student, could be an administrator, kind of depends on what your tool is. But what kind of expertise will people need to be able to use this? So this is where you'll have to think of things like, ethics related to data collection, ethics related to data use, policies around data governance, technical aspects of implementation. So like, is it built into the learning management system, or do I have to know somebody who can like run a server for me, or that kind of thing? So that's going to affect, who can use it and how maybe excited or motivated they'll be to try something. Then there's also the conceptual aspects of that use. So, how sophisticated is the analysis or models, right? If someone has to interpret a dashboard that you've provided, for example, how much training do they need to be able to make the right sorts of conclusions from that you would have expected? How much do they have to know about the underlying model or computation or the data involved? There's probably some data literacy in there. You could think of, a dashboard of like summary statistics might be something people can interpret relatively well, but if you have some sort of engagement index from a predictive model, that's much more complicated and probably requires more nuance to interpret. So that's, again, this is like an education problem. And so you want to think about how are people going to learn, how you're not going to get them in a classroom to teach them, but the same principles of learning apply. What are other factors in expertise? So yeah, knowing when a particular tool or approach or analysis applies and when it doesn't, right? So that's expertise in kind of using, say, learning analytics more broadly. And any of these could be new to an instructor or their students, or the learning technology support folks that might be kind of tasked with direct support to faculty or that kind of thing. So, this is all kind of in the mix when we think about, spreading practices across an institution. So in terms of, these are some considerations. I guess if I had sort of a where do we start, what are some things that I might want to think about doing? So if you've got, your research study, your pilot implementation, and you're ready to try to spread that, or it doesn't even have to be yours. It could be just one that's a favorite of yours that you want to import from another place. I think of kind of these were sort of core things that, as far as like what you're doing, one is capturing that. So what did you do and how did you know it was good? So you've got to convince yourself, and you want to kind of write this stuff down, because you'll be doing this communicating. So who do you need to talk to? How do you tell them? The good news is, your analytics experience helps here, right? So you know about, gathering data, summarizing, visualizing, telling stories from data. I think this was also kind of mentioned in the previous keynote, this idea that you can kind of use the approaches of learning analytics to evaluate learning analytics and the sort of impact and uptake. So, but, again, the sort of like a research paper probably isn't going to cover things like, technical documentation related to deploying this, particularly on your campus's systems, whatever they are. It may not have, may not talk about user support. What does an instructor need to know? What do students need to know to use this tool? So then you're going to be generating things like one-page briefs, something you can email people. I think even if you have a website, I think people have very low expectations about being able to learn from institutional websites. I don't know if that's not a comment that I have like a great study to back up on hand, but basically you need different communication channels, and it has to be things that people will be able to and maybe even want to read and interpret, which generally means it has to be shorter, so it's very targeted to that specific audience. But you could do things like include instructions for instructors, example language that an instructor could put in their syllabus or these sorts of things, right? So the closer you can get it to like, I can visualize this in my teaching practice, the better. And of course, it doesn't have to be you doing this telling. So how do you tell them doesn't mean like, do you email them or not? Or do you email them or make a video? It's, can you get someone else who's maybe closer to that specific person to do this communicating on your behalf? Because that may be more powerful if they're sort of closer in the network to the instructors you're trying to reach. And then you'll eventually start thinking about structural supports. So what needs to be in place? What sort of hosting options are available? What did you learn in pilot cases that might inform, like, how do we roll this out? Or what partnerships do we need to make this really established institutionally? So, so these are all kind of part of making plans. I have like a few considerations of key lessons. So I'm hoping these kind of draw on various things that have come through, both in the talk or other things that I wanted to mention. But there's this idea that like being right isn't quite enough, right? So having a good tool that doesn't mean that people will use it. So you need to worry a lot about that communication piece and bringing research to practice. You meet people where they are as much as possible. So do we need discipline-based education specialists, or sorry, learning analytics specialists in every department? Not necessarily, but you do want to think about like, how far away are you in the organization, say, from the people that are you want to kind of use these tools. For big sustainable change, we need complementary approaches. So you have people involved in various ways and at different levels of the institution. Planning is important. So this, who's the change for? Who has to do the work? What role will different people have? Some of them may be taking on the role of change agents, which is a term you come across quite a bit in the change literature. And this idea of really using networks. So having a network that spans disciplines, regions, and roles, which this is such a community that does, there's real power to be drawn there. So you'll need to extend this into your local institution, your local network. I'll mention one sort of example that's kind of inspired work here. So Indiana University Bloomington's Center for Learning Analytics and Student Success. So there's an indicator. They have a center, right, involving learning analytics. Not everybody does. And their Learning Analytics Fellows program. So this now, it's like a package that includes, they have a grant program, fellows designation, they have an annual summit which showcases work. So these are all elements that indicate like, oh, this is something that's kind of broad at the institution. There's ways to engage new people. There's ways to make it possible for people to connect with experts in certain areas, but it's also drawing on like the interests of the faculty and the departments at the institution. UBC, we've made some steps towards broad adoption of learning analytics and academic analytics, but I'd say we're sort of in progress. We have a great community of practitioners that meets regularly to share projects. We had a learning analytics initiative that established a team and some example projects and tools a few years ago, but it's not like an ongoing, center in quite the same way. A lot of data governance policy has been hammered out in kind of recent years. So there's sort of a convergence of things. Our team in the Faculty of Science, we're doing a kind of needs analysis actually a lot of it this month, talking with each department, like what are your interests in learning analytics and academic analytics? Where can we help and work with you on sort of that data piece? Searching for those latent aims, again, to use that phrase. And we'd like to move towards some kind of fellows model inspired by the Indiana folks. So to wrap up, there are lots of examples of institutional change at different scales to draw on. So depending on what you want to try to accomplish. Reading about them, talking over ideas with your team. I'm also, do get in touch. I'm happy to chat. My pitch in talking about the expertise stuff is that you can think about getting people to learn, or think of this as an education challenge in terms of people taking on and using things in their teaching practice. And really importantly, there's a lot to do in making a large change. So, this initiative I talked about, there was a handful of these specialists hired in 2007. No one really knew where it was going to go in 10 years, but, it's course by course and connection by connection. It built up to this very large success to where teaching here is really very different than it was. But you need a large team of people to do that. So the good news is you don't have to do everything yourself, and small changes add up over time. And I'll mention this one last set of tools, the Accelerating Systemic Change in STEM Higher Education Network. They have a change dashboard and all kinds of different interesting kind of tools to help you think through these processes and examples. So again, it's about mapping out some ideas and kind of taking it from there. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn it over to questions now, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.